A German tank commander peers through his periscope. Smoke clears over a ridge in Normandy. He counts the wrecks his crew destroyed yesterday, 6 Shermans, burning in a row. He looks again today. There are 6 more, not damaged, not the same tanks repaired, new ones replaced overnight. Somewhere in Berlin, an intelligence officer is staring at a production estimate from across the Atlantic and crossing out the number because it cannot possibly be true. It was true, and the men who refused to believe it were about to lose a war they thought they understood. This is the story of a number Germany could not accept, and the industrial machine that made it real. To understand why this number broke German assumptions, you have to understand what German planners believed about America in the first place. In the 1930s, the United States was not seen as an industrial threat. It was seen as a sleeping giant with no appetite for a European war. German military attachés filed reports describing an economy still recovering from the Depression, a public opinion fiercely opposed to overseas entanglement, and an army so small it ranked below Romania's in raw manpower. That assessment wasn't unreasonable in 1938. It became dangerously outdated by 1942. What German intelligence services failed to track was not American intention. That, eventually, became obvious. What they failed to track was American industrial architecture. The United States possessed something no other combatant nation had: a civilian automotive industry already organized around mass production, standardized parts, and assembly line discipline, employing hundreds of thousands of skilled workers, run by men like William Knudsen, pulled directly from General Motors to help direct the nation's war production effort. When Detroit converted from cars to tanks, it didn't have to invent mass production. It already owned it. Germany, by contrast, built tanks the way it had always built fine machinery, relying on skilled craftsmen, hand-fitted components, and small batches refined for performance, not throughput. 2 industrial philosophies, 2 different wars being prepared for, and only one side understood it was the production count, not just the design sheet, that would decide the outcome. Picture 2 factory floors. In Kassel, Germany, technicians work on a Panther tank's transmission with the precision of watchmakers. Every gear is fitted, tested, and adjusted by hand. The tank that results is a formidable weapon, fast for its weight, well-armored, devastating at range. It also requires roughly twice the labor hours of an American Sherman, draws on alloy supplies that are increasingly scarce as the war drags on, and when it breaks down in the field, repair often means waiting for parts that don't exist in standardized form, because no 2 production batches were ever entirely identical. Now picture a Chrysler plant outside Detroit. Hulls move down a line. Workers, many of them women newly trained for industrial roles, install identical components in a repeatable sequence. The tank that comes off this line, the M4 Sherman, is not the best tank in the war by almost any individual metric. Crews who fought in it knew its weaknesses well. But it can be built in roughly a third of the time of a Panther, repaired with interchangeable parts pulled from any other Sherman, and shipped by the thousands. This is the gap nobody in Berlin fully priced in. Germany was building the better individual machine. America was building a better system. German military intelligence wasn't lazy. It was working from a flawed model. Pre-war assessments of American industrial capacity were built on data from a peacetime civilian economy and extrapolated using European assumptions about how quickly a nation could retool for war. Those assumptions held for Germany itself, where the armaments ministry struggled for years against fragmented planning and competing party interests. They did not hold for the United States. When the War Production Board began converting consumer factories to military output in 1942, the speed stunned even American planners. Automobile production lines that had built 500,000 civilian cars a year pivoted to building tanks, trucks, and aircraft within months, not because of some hidden genius, but because the infrastructure for mass coordination already existed. It had been built by Ford, by GM, by Chrysler, over decades of peacetime competition. German analysts received fragments of this picture through diplomatic channels, intercepted reports, and captured documents, and consistently revised their estimates downward, because the true figures didn't fit the model they trusted. It is a pattern intelligence historians recognize well. When new data contradicts a deeply held assumption, organizations tend to distrust the data before they distrust the assumption. By 1944, American factories were producing thousands of Sherman tanks a month, alongside a flood of trucks, half-tracks, and landing craft that allowed those tanks to actually reach the front in usable numbers. Germany, even under Albert Speer's reorganized armaments ministry, credited at the time with a so-called production miracle, was producing a fraction of that volume, concentrated in fewer, more complex vehicles. The math became brutal in its simplicity. German tanks generally carried better armor and more firepower than their American counterparts, but a Sherman crew destroyed in the morning could, in practical terms, be replaced with a fresh tank and crew before the same German unit had finished repairing battle damage on a single Panther. This wasn't a secret weapon, it wasn't a tactical breakthrough, it was an arithmetic war fought in factories most soldiers on either side would never see. For frontline German units, the psychological effect of this arithmetic was its own kind of weapon. Veterans' accounts from the Normandy campaign and later the defense of Germany itself describe a recurring unease. Units would inflict what should have been decisive losses on American armor, only to face fresh formations days later, sometimes hours later, seemingly undiminished. This wasn't an illusion. It was logistics made visible on the battlefield. The United States wasn't just building tanks faster, it was shipping them across an ocean, distributing them through an enormous supply network, and replacing combat losses at a rate that outpaced anything German planners believed was logistically possible. Here's the twist that makes this story so compelling. While German intelligence consistently underestimated American tank production, Allied intelligence developed a method that nearly perfectly estimated German tank production, using nothing but serial numbers stamped on captured vehicle parts. Post-war records confirmed that statistical estimation using this method came remarkably close to the actual German production rate, far more accurate than conventional intelligence gathering had managed. The irony is almost poetic. The side that built precision machinery couldn't accurately judge its enemy's industrial output. The side mass-producing machinery built a precision statistical method to measure its enemy instead. Each side's strength reflected its national approach to production itself. Germany trusted craftsmanship and instinct, America trusted systems and data. By the war's final year, the gap was no longer a planning error, it was the war. German armor doctrine had been built around the assumption that quality could offset quantity, and for individual engagements, it often did. But for a war stretching from the Atlantic Wall to the Eastern Front to North Africa, sustainment mattered more than any single tank's superiority. Vehicles like the Tiger could dominate any single Allied opponent, but across multiple massive fronts, devoting resources to a handful of extremely expensive vehicles proved to be a serious strategic miscalculation. Post-war economic analysis has since complicated the popular legend of Speer's armament miracle, with some historians arguing the production increases credited to his ministry were less a managerial triumph and more the natural recovery of an economy that had been operating below its real capacity for the war's first years. Either way, no level of German reorganization could close a gap built on a fundamentally different industrial base. One with more raw material access, no bombing campaign disrupting its factories, and a manufacturing culture already optimized for repeatable, large-scale output. The lesson German planners failed to absorb in time has since become a foundational principle of modern military logistics. In a prolonged, multi-front war, the side that can replace its losses faster will eventually defeat the side that can only build its losses better. There's a quiet irony at the heart of this story. Germany built some of the most respected tanks of the 20th century, vehicles still studied by engineers and military historians today for their design sophistication. And it lost the armor war anyway. Not because its tanks were wrong, because its model of war was wrong. It planned for a conflict where the better machine wins. It ended up fighting a conflict where the better system wins, where assembly lines, statisticians, and shipping schedules mattered as much as armor thickness and gun caliber. Maybe that's the real story underneath the steel and the smoke. Wars are not only won by what happens on the battlefield. They're won, often quietly, by what happens on the factory floor, by the side that understands, faster than its enemy, what kind of war is actually being fought.